Assalamu alaikum students. This is English LL.B part 2 and today this is our first lecture. We are going to cover or we are going to start up with the short story that named The Moving Finger. According to the examination point of view, as we can see, the story is the most important one. Almost in every past paper we can see a question from this story. So from examination point of view, from examiner's point of view, this story is really important. As we can see in your notes, I have added actually two questions that are from your past papers. The writer is asking about to write a short note on the mysterious elements associated with the portrait of Mrs. Grancy in the short story titled Moving Finger by Edith Wharton. Describe the elements of mystery in the story The Moving Finger. Okay, as far as story is concerned, the story actually revolves around three main characters, that is Mr. Grancy, Mrs. Grancy, and a close friend of Mr. Grancy who is Culloden, who is a painter. The story starts off with Mr. and Mrs. Grancy getting married. Mr. Grancy is actually getting married for the second time after the death of his first wife, with whom he was not very much happy. She was so bossy and she had a very commanding nature that Mr. Grancy has actually molded himself according to what she wanted, but he was not actually happy with her. But when she got married with Mrs. Grancy, he actually felt that he is living a life. But unfortunately, we see in the story that after those 3 happy years, Mrs. Grancy died because of some natural death. During their marriage or during the happy period that they had of 3 years, Mr. Grancy make his friend Culloden to make a portrait of Mrs. Grancy. Now see, there is a difference between a portrait, an image and a picture. You people or the students, they get mixed up with these three terms. Okay, so be very focused while writing your answer that you are not going to use the word of picture or an image. You are going to use the word the portrait. And throughout the story, we see the word portrait everywhere, not an image or a picture is actually used in in your story. So what happens that we see in the picture, continuing my lecture, we see in the picture that we see in the story that Mr. Culloden is actually absorbed in the painting of Mrs. Grancy. Okay, and we see that whenever Mr. Grancy is going to call him or his friends for a tea party on weekends at his house, which was in the village where he used to live with Mrs. Grancy too. So we observe or we see in the story that Culloden is continuously looking at the portrait of Mrs. Grancy. So this thing is showing his affiliation with Mrs. Grancy or the portrait. That is actually a mystery that is going to get resolved at the end of this story. Okay, moving on. When Mr. Grancy see that, or other friends of Mr. Grancy observe that the Culloden is actually involved in Mrs. Grancy, but after the death of Mrs. Grancy, we see that Mr. Grancy is going to make his friend to alter the portrait. Like he is going to tell him to change the picture according to the age that Mrs. Grancy would be if she would be alive. So he is going to alter the picture, and we observe that by altering the picture, the health of Mr. Grancy is going to get worse. So the doctor is actually very much worried that his disease is not that much severe or serious the way his condition is getting worse. But ultimately, when the Culloden is going to change the picture to a very depressed old lady, Mr. Grancy dies. Before his death, what Culloden do, he actually take a will from Mr. Grancy that after his death, the picture is going to be donated to Culloden. That was a point where we observe the selfish nature of Culloden. Okay, this was a story. So from a examination point of view, if we are going to see that what the examiner is going to focus in the story, the questions he is going to make from a short story are based on the themes, the character sketch, and some mystery that is going on in the story. He is going to ask you about the hidden thing, not the apparent thing that's present in the story. So first of all, we are going to look at the themes in this story. Here the obvious themes in the story are captivity, obsession, infidelity, while we can see the theme of selfishness prevailing all over the story, especially in the Culloden's character. Okay, the second thing is that though the story has lots of other characters as well, but the most prominent characters on which the examiner can make the questions are of Mr. Grancy, Mrs. Grancy and Culloden. Among them, Mr. Grancy and Culloden's character are the most important one. Culloden character is important since he is the only one who is being selfish throughout the story, and the mystery in the story is mostly linked with his character. If we can see his affiliation with the picture, actually is a mystery. The way Mrs. Grancy dies, or Mrs. Grancy 1 and Mrs. Grancy 2 dies, is a mystery. The way Mr. Grancy died is a mystery as well. So we are going to focus on these three things in this story.